at the Foreign Office. And I'm delighted to to have on the stage with me a highly distinguished panel as we talk about how we create the policy environment, the context for women's economic empowerment. Because today is all about the road to empowerment. And we're going to be talking about how we can support women's economic empowerment, whether it's having access to her own resources and assets, her income, the ability to decide for herself how to spend it and use it, the capacity to work in an environment that's respectful and free from discrimination, harassment, and violence or abuse, and also to get paid the same for it. All very topical issues. And as we look around the world, we know that women are often disproportionately represented in the informal economy, which will offer sometimes the most accessible part of the labour market, but also putting them at a distinct disadvantage in terms of job security, pay levels, the potential for exploitation, lack of social protection. And additionally, marginalised groups such as those with disabilities or the rural-urban divide are particularly affected. Outdated laws, we heard our Prime Minister, Theresa May, today talk about outdated laws, make it further restricting women's ability to sometimes participate in the workforce. And of course, social norms may hold them back further. And this is a tragic waste of potential. If you were in the previous session, we talked about the potential that bringing women into trade and the economy really can bring the economic prosperity benefit and dividend of that. When women participate in the economy, it brings them wealth and self-sufficiency, improves their prospects for themselves, their families, and their wider communities. And as we also heard, women tend to put back about 90% of what they earn into their local economy, health, education, services. Now, my team here know I'm a bit of a statistics geek, and I make I'm proud of that, but sometimes the statistics bear repeating. We've heard today from the McKinsey Global Institute's that report that's often quoted and often repeated that between $12 and $28 trillion could be added to the global economy if women, by 2025 if women took an equivalent role to men in the economy. That's over 26% of the global GDP. The World Economic Forum, a source I use a lot as I travel, estimates the global economic gender gap could take 217 years to close, up from 170 last year. Globally, the average gender pay gap is about 23%. The female unemployment rate is about 50%, whereas for men it is about 76%. And again, I'm sorry guys, we've heard this before, women do at least 2.5 times as much unpaid house and care work. So the question today for this afternoon's session is, how do we create a policy environment, the context, the conditions that support women's economic empowerment? We'll hear more from our panel of experts, but I think it takes a multifaceted approach. It needs governments to be setting the policies and practices that enables girls to go to school, have a quality education, and come out with the skills that enable them to take part in an economy. It means training teachers to pass on knowledge, creating the conditions, social, cultural, economic, for women to be employed. And that might mean changing outdated legislation. A UN report found that of 155 of 173 countries sampled, at least one legal restriction was in place that prevented women from playing their full role in the economy. And while legislation can be changed and policies introduced, changing social norms and mindsets is harder and can take longer. So we need to make the business and the economic case as well. We want to see companies and organisations willing to recruit, to retain and reward women in the same way as they do men, and supporting women at every level to rise up the ranks to take on that leadership role. And I think it means opening up vistas beyond traditionally accepted roles. For example, going into STEM, where women are particularly underrepresented, and building confidence in young women so they have the potential to be the leaders of the future. It's not rocket science, but it does need political will and motivation and incentives to change. Otherwise, that very long 217 years will be even further from our grasp. And I think within the Commonwealth, we are uniquely placed to work together, to learn from each other, and as our Prime Minister Theresa May said, go and change the world. So I'll leave it there for now, because I think we have other members of the panel who I'm delighted to have join us today. So for the session, I'll invite each member to say a few words, about 5 minutes in turn, and then we'll have a conversation, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. So start thinking of your questions now, because there will be roving microphones picking up later today. So I'd like to start by inviting Dr. Joseph Muscat, His Excellency, the Prime Minister of Malta. You were a journalist and elected to the National Executive at the age of 21 and have served as Education Secretary. In 2006, you were the recipient of the Outstanding Young Person of the Year. You've been a Market Intelligence Manager and an Investment Advisor, and we'd very much like to hear from you about your thoughts on women's economic empowerment.
So, thank you very much. I do believe that the points you mentioned on education and making sure that young girls have access to education is simply the first building block. And we cannot really and truly think that we have achieved anything if we are just at that stage. I would like to share with you some of our experience in Malta over the past 5 years, where we managed to climb up the list of countries in the European Union and in Europe, wider Europe, of female participation in the labor force. We were laggards, we were almost at the very bottom of the list, and we have managed to go up to the European, more or less to the European average now. We're still not happy. Key was empowerment, but key was really and truly understanding our society and trying to remove the obstacles to women joining the labor force. One key decision we took, and I don't want to be misinterpreted, we did not take this decision solely on the grounds of equality. But even if someone doesn't believe in equality, if you look at it simply from the economic point of view, it makes economic sense to free this huge potential. So this is not just an ideological debate on equality, one which we must have within our Commonwealth, but it is also a common sense economic approach to the issue. One key decision we took 5 years ago was to introduce universal free childcare for all working parents, whether it's women, men, single parents, gay couples, whoever has a kid and wants to be engaged in the labor market, he or she gets childcare for free. It costs a lot. It costs a lot of money, and some of my consultants at first were telling me, you know, this will be an extremely expensive program, but that's looking at something simply from an accounting point of view. The truth is that this program on its own freed so much potential that it is nowadays paying for itself, because so many more women joined the labor force, especially women, especially single mothers who were on benefits. They were faced with a system where, given a choice, it didn't make sense for them to join the labor market, but they'd rather stay on benefits because the premium, the additional benefit for them to go the extra mile was simply not there. So we introduced universal free childcare. We introduced the tapering of benefits, meaning that, and this was especially targeted for single mothers and women on benefits, saying that if you are on benefits but you get a job, you don't lose your benefits immediately. But they get tapered over a 3-year period, and there can be extensions to that, which means that even, and you were mentioning a very valid fact, that women are substantially represented in the informal economy. Once they make the transition from the informal to the formal economy, they tend to go, at least our experience was, they tend to go in the lower paid jobs. So we saw it, we sought to have a sort of wage supplement, which would then remove them from poverty, really. And I will tell you 2 things, and I will stop here for now, which for us were very interesting. First of all, over just 5 years, even through this sort of feminist approach to poverty reduction, we managed to reduce the number of people in severe material deprivation by 2/3. So the number of people suffering from severe material deprivation is now just 1/3 than it was 3 years ago, and now it stands at around 3.8%, I believe, which is in line with not in line, much lower than the EU average. The second point that came as a statistical shock to us was that until 5 years ago, when not so many women were engaged in our labor force, our pay gap statistics were very healthy. Once more women started coming in the labor force, the pay gap widened. And that was, for me, shocking, but understandable. It meant that looking at pay gap statistics, simple from a superficial point of view, you don't necessarily get the right feeling of how women are faring in an economy. We were getting a better picture because less women were taking part in our economy. Once more women are taking part, we have a worse picture, but a more realistic picture. And ironically, women are better off right now. So I am one of those advocates saying that there should be a zero pay gap. We have it in our constitution. We're implementing our laws to that effect. But I would caution against making this pay gap issue simply analyzing it from a very superficial point of view, but seeing really and truly what the other variables are.
Thank you very much indeed, Your Excellency, and picking up the points of childcare and gender pay gap, both of which are very topical at the moment. I think there's much that we could learn from you. Thank you. I'd like to turn now to Her Excellency, the Vice President of Tanzania, Samia Hassan Suluhu. You were elected and became minister in 2010. You are the first ever female Vice President of Tanzania, and you were party to drafting the new constitution as well. So we'd very much like to hear your perspective today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Joanna, for inviting me to this panel. And frankly speaking, the issue of women empowerment doesn't need to be overemphasized. And women's economic empowerment is both sound investment as well as good economics. As we know that women development is closely correlated with the development of the country. Any developed country, you could see that the women of the country are having good living standards and well developed. So it remains ever true that the best way to measure countries' progress is by looking at the status of its women more than the GDP. And talking of the informal sector, frankly speaking, is that informal sector has women face. Many women are involved in informal sector, and in Tanzania, for instance, women are more engaged in agriculture, and about 64% of them are the owners of the small and medium enterprises. So having these facts, our government is now working on creating enabling policy and legal framework to formalize their settings and pave them a way to easily access capital and credit facilities, connect to social protection and health insurance schemes. And for us, full empowerment of women include the removal of social, cultural, economic, and political barriers to their growth. So, in the interest of time, let me look on 3 aspects: on access to land, women in Tanzania on access to land, on access to credit, and the legal framework of our policies to develop women. So on access to land, Tanzania enacted Land and Village Land Act and its consequential amendments, which guaranteed women right to own, to use, and to dispose land whenever they feel like. And a review of this act came with an establishment of the land tribunal or land tribunal at the local level. And this act prescribed that 3 out of 7 members of the tribunal should be women, must be women, because women suffer more on land issues than men. And on access to credit, Tanzania managed to establish a Women Development Fund, village community banks, and savings and credit cooperative societies for them to provide soft loans and entrepreneurial skills to women. We also have made a provision that in every district council must set 5% of its internal revenue and invest it in women development activities. We also have a provision that ring fence at least 30% of the government procurement to business owned by women. 30% is given to women or to women who owns business. But in addition to government initiatives, we do have conducive business environment and policies that have enabled booming mobile money services that have worked to the advantage of the women. And most women are in formal sector. Through the use of digitized payment, the lives of women, especially in the rural areas, have been improved. We also established the Tanzania Women Banks, or Tanzania Women Bank, which is now giving soft loans to the women groups for their own development. But furthermore, the commercial banks in Tanzania have been able to open the new windows and open or design the special accounts to give loans to women, loans with soft conditions to women. But again, on institutional policy and legal framework, we have set policies and laws that ensure protection from gender-based violence and exploitation, access to gender-specific health needs, access to education and clean water. And also our constitution guarantees the equality of rights between women and men. And on this basis, women have access to run for political offices. And that's why here I am as a Vice President of the United Republic of Tanzania. While the government is trying to appoint women to top positions, the story seems different in private sector. In private sector, it is estimated that only 20% of the whole business community in Tanzania, women are on top positions. But the truth is, if we are to succeed with women's economic empowerment, we must ensure that more women are involved in leadership and decision-making tables across both sectors, public and private sector. So it is about time now that public and private sector join hands to make the empowerment of women more meaningful. And having seated here, talking to my fellow women, I would just like to make a call that let us make concerted efforts to ensure that we build an empowered future for women and girls. Advancing women economic empowerment should not only be the moral imperative, but justice to humanity. Enough of rhetoric. Now let's start doing. Let us walk the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for setting out what you're doing and have been doing to support young and small business owners in Tanzania. And I completely agree. We've heard a lot. We need to kind of crack on with the action now as well. Thank you. I'd like to turn now to Charlotte McLean-Lapo, who is the Global Disability Advisor for the World Bank. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Your work focuses on disability inclusive development under the twin World Bank goals to end poverty and promote shared prosperity. And you make sure that policies, programs and projects are inclusive in their approach. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I'd like to preface my remarks this afternoon by really stressing the fact that women with disabilities do not constitute a homogeneous group. They have visible disabilities, they have invisible disabilities. They're young, they're old, they're urban, they're rural, they're refugees, they're migrants, they're straight, they're gay. They really are part of our human diversity. And it's really important that we recognize that women with disabilities account for it's estimated that 1 in 5 women worldwide have a disability or will experience disability in their lifetime. These women are innovators, they're mothers, they're daughters, they're leaders, they're lawyers, they're entrepreneurs, scientists, they're vital members of their society. They're you and they're me. And so today I'd like to talk about 3 particular issues that relate to economic empowerment. First of all, what would this look like for women with disabilities? Well, we know that when we invest in empowering women with disabilities, we build more resilient societies for all. And we deliver the promise of the Sustainable Development Goals to leave no one behind. And in addition to that, we know that we can address poverty and boost shared prosperity by including women with disabilities. We also know that women and girls with disabilities are among some of the most vulnerable and marginalized groups because of the multiple and intersecting discriminations that they experience. And these intersecting discriminations may be based on age, it may be based on gender, race, sexual orientation, and many other factors. And quite frankly, this intersectionality aspect is often absent from mainstream women's initiatives that seek to empower women. So right there, we have a problem. An enabling policy environment for the economic empowerment of women with disabilities must therefore, in my view, do a couple of things. First of all, it has to be premised on the principle of non-discrimination. It has to address the equalization of opportunity. But in doing that, it has to make sure that it provides reasonable accommodations for women with disabilities to succeed. And that might look like, for instance, ensuring that accessible ICT is provided to a student. This enables a brilliant young woman, Herma Gerber, a deafblind woman, to graduate from Harvard Law School because she had these accommodations. Accommodations may mean putting up a ramp so that I can get onto the stage and be part of this discussion. So these accommodations have to be considered when we think about the empowerment of women. An enabling policy environment for the economic empowerment of women should also straddle across all sectors. It should support entrepreneurship. It should focus on the changing nature of work and what this will mean for women and for women with disabilities. It should also make sure that it puts in place active measures to remove the systemic barriers that women with disabilities face. And it absolutely has to insist on equal pay for equal work and work for equal value. And it has to prohibit discrimination against women with disabilities in their participation and in their access to labor markets. Too often what we find is that policies are either not internalized by policymakers, so the policy might be there, but it has not been internalized by the policymaker, or not implemented due to insufficient budgets. So we need to insist on implementing effective measures to protect the rights of women with disabilities on an equal basis on others. And we need to make sure that we're looking at aspects related to recruitment. When we recruit, are we recruiting women with disabilities? Retention, that's a really important piece. Are we retaining women with disabilities in our companies? Are we promoting women with disabilities? Are we providing accessible and safe spaces for them to work? This is important, and the way we can do this is to begin to look at how we mainstream disability inclusion into all of our policies, how we train our staff, and how we monitor if we're really serious about this. The second point that I'd like to touch on briefly is some of the existing challenges. And some of the really critical challenges that still exist in terms of women participating or women with disabilities participating are stigma, are the social norms, and approaches that discriminate against women but also infantilize women with disabilities. And so this needs to change if we think about women, if we're going to think about women with disabilities as part of our society. We know that globally women with disabilities are far less likely to be in employment. Some statistics estimate that 75% of women with disabilities are not in employment. And I think for me that's a very serious percentage out there. I think it's also important that we recognize that in many instances, women with disabilities' rights are prohibited in terms of their access to credit and their access to assets. So that is a very important piece. And I think lastly, I'd just like to say my third piece that I wanted to communicate this afternoon is to really point to the fact that some progress has been made. There's a Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. There's an article in there, Article 6, that addresses the rights of women with disabilities. We have the Sustainable Development Goals that are fairly inclusive. So in terms of a global architecture, we really have a strong and a robust frame. What we don't see, and we really don't see enough of, is the actual implementation. And it's only until we start getting serious about implementation and the inclusion of women with disabilities at all levels will we start really reaching the goals that we've set out to. A recent World Bank study looked at census data in select African countries, and in that study we found that only 17% of girls with disabilities were finishing grade school, primary school. Now, if that's the case, what is the likelihood that you're going to have a huge pool when you're looking to employ women with disabilities? And so we can't think about any kind of enabling policies for women with disabilities if we don't think about them as intersecting pieces. And so I'd just like to close by saying, you know, good policies have to be implemented, and we need to make sure that we strengthen our overall normative and legislative frameworks, that we insist on indicators and collect disability disaggregated data so that we actually know how we're doing. We need to make sure that when we look at mainstreamed policies for women, that we're really serious about including women with disabilities in that. And finally, I'd just like to say, in the era of disruptive technologies, there are huge possibilities to really make sure that we bring women with disabilities into the fold and empower all women and work towards meeting the SDGs. Thank you for your attention.
Good. Thank you very much indeed, and I absolutely agree. We've heard before, now is the time to turn the words into action, but also that holding that mirror up to ourselves so we have inclusive implementation, I think is absolutely vital. Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to turn now to Shirley Price, who is the president of the Jamaica Households Workers Union. You started, if I may, as a former domestic worker. You have your master's in labour law from Penn State University. You've worked as an advocate for Jamaican and Caribbean domestic workers and are a founding member of the JHW, the Jamaican Household Workers Association, where you've had the group classified formally as a union with the ILO. So we're very much looking to hear from you about your perspective and your experiences. Thank you very much, Shirley.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Domestic workers comprise a significant part of the global workforce in informal employment and are among the most vulnerable groups of workers. We work for a private household, often without clear terms of employment. We are unregistered in any book and are excluded from the scope of legal legislation. Currently, there are at least 67 million domestic workers worldwide. Domestic workers often face with very low wages, excessive long hours, have not guaranteed a weekly days or rest. We are exploited. We are not under any laws. We are undervalued. Our work is undervalued. We are underpaid. We are invisible. We are not recognized, and we are not respected. But we are the backbone of society. As I always say, we are the oil in the wheel. If we stop work, the world stops, and that's a reality. Our jobs are very important to the development of any country. Our work, though sometimes not seen by many as important, support thousands of men or women to move on, to enable themselves. But we have to organize and fight. And in organizing and fighting, we empower ourselves. Traditionally, domestic workers in Jamaica did not have a means of expressing our issues or problems facing us. Thus, we formed the Jamaica Household Workers Union in 1991. This provided us with the opportunity to bring our concern both to the government and the attention of the public for discussion and action. We started out with 175 members with one chapter. Presently, we have 5,700 members and 13 chapters across Jamaica. We did not stop there. We went, and myself and my colleague from Trinidad, Ada LeBlanc, and we formed the Caribbean Domestic Workers Network, because if we work collectively, we have more voice, we can have power, so we can have economic empowerment. And that's what we did. We formed it with 6 Caribbean islands. Again, we said we want to be bold for change. So we collectively with domestic workers across the world formed the International Domestic Workers Federation. Now we boast over 600,000 members with 58 affiliates worldwide. I myself was a domestic worker for 31 years, and I think I was one of the most abused domestic workers. I remember, I'm going to share my experience, one of my experiences, where I wanted to go to school because I believe that the only way for me to get out of poverty is for me to educate myself. So I was working as a living domestic worker. And when I go to school in the evening, my employer would not allow me back in the house. So I had to sleep in a doghouse. And this is for months. And every morning she would came out and she opened the door for me to come in and make breakfast. She has never asked me one day, where do you sleep or anything. And I've been doing that for months. And I went in and I made the breakfast for her and the family, sent them off to work and school, and I proceed as if nothing happened because I have an aim. I want to empower myself. And I stayed there under the abuse. I cooked and I couldn't eat the food. She would say to me, go and get a sardine. And I did, because I have an aim. Today, I stayed there and I finished my first degree in social work. And Penn State University invited me to speak at their Workers' Rights Symposium. It was 24 of us, so it was 23 professors and Shirley Price. And when I finished spoke, they offered me a full scholarship to do my master's there.
Fantastic.
And I did my master's, and I graduated with an advanced master's in labor law and global workers' rights. So that's empowerment. That's empowerment. So last year, July, I won the Caribbean Woman of the Year. So you're now looking at the Caribbean Woman of the Year. So we talk about empowerment. You know, I can speak to it. And what I'm doing now is go around the world empowering domestic workers that they can do it. This is an example of empowerment, so you can do it. I'm meeting the government across the world, asking them to ratify the convention that we domestic workers went to Geneva and to get on the agenda. Domestic workers from across the world went to Geneva at the ILO to get our issue on the agenda. And we got the Domestic Worker Convention adopted in 2011. Now we have 29 countries that ratify that convention to put laws in place for domestic workers worldwide. That's empowerment. That's what we're saying. Government, we're asking you, sir, Prime Minister, if you don't ratify the convention as yet, sir, we're asking you to ratify the Convention 189 so domestic workers in your country can be empowered. Thank you very much.
We will.
Thank you. Thank you.
Shirley, thank you very much for that immensely personal, powerful story of economic empowerment. Thank you very much, and we will come back to you shortly. Let me turn now to Margot, and you're Dr. Margot Thomas. You're the former Chief of Secretariat for the United Nations Secretary General's High-Level Panel on Women's Economic Empowerment. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Your career in public policy has spanned over 25 years, holding senior leadership positions at the World Bank International Finance Corporation Advisory Services. You provided advice to more than 50 developing, transitioning and post-conflict governments. So we're looking at how do we create the policy space from the very sort of strategic and international. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you very much, Joanna. I want to say how honored I am to be part of this panel. But one of the things about coming last is that many of the relevant points have already been made. So I'll make my remarks brief, and I hope that with Shirley's really energetic call to action, we can leave each and every one of us this room inspired to take action individually. The point, and it's clearly from the introduction, I come to this not as a gender expert. Spent a lot of time advising governments on policy, private sector development. One of the realizations, I like to say I backed into the gender issue, because one of the realizations that came to us and within the World Bank Group in this push for economic growth was that if women are not fully economically empowered and their contribution is not fully enabled or recognized, we're actually imposing a tax in the foregone economic growth and economic benefits. Christine Lagarde, at the launch of the first high-level panel report, made a statement that I thought is so succinct, and I keep repeating it. She said, women's economic empowerment is not just a moral imperative, it's an economic no-brainer. And I think this is what we heard in the Prime Minister's comments in terms of pushing this agenda forward because of the inherent benefits, not just to women, but to all of society. We have the evidence that speaks to the fact that when women are empowered, society benefits, not just the economic growth, they're more likely to invest in their children. Men benefit, and when women invest in children, it's not in girls, it's girls and boys. There's greater social stability. There is the potential for greater economic diversity and greater equity in the distribution of wealth and income. So the question here is, we know that this policy space is not static. The high-level panel did a brilliant job in identifying the systemic constraints and the drivers to push women's economic empowerment forward under SDG 5, which cuts across all of the other SDGs. It just makes that point again. But the panel identified 7 drivers. One, and we've heard different ways in which it's been tackled. Vice President Sununu was on the panel, so she took an active part in shaping this. Tackling the adverse norms and practices that often limit women's roles and promote this disproportionate responsibility for care and all that it means as a result. I think the Prime Minister's example speaks to what can happen when this is addressed head-on in a practical way. The economic benefits far outweigh the costs, which is what you've shown. And I would like to include the example from Malta in the work that we're doing under the T20 now in looking at policy advice for the governments of the 20 nations and the rest of the world. Ensuring legal protections. We've heard, again from the Prime Minister and from Vice President of Tanzania, constitutional protections have been enacted to enable and to assure freedom. But unfortunately, as we also heard, the recent World Bank Women in Law report of 2018 estimated that at least 90% of all the countries in the world have at least one legal restriction that impacts women as economic actors. The need to recognize, reduce, and redistribute care work is essential if we're going to unlock this economic potential and release the value. Building assets, broadly written, it's in terms of digital access, we heard about that, financial assets, and property. Property rights is a big one in this space. Changing corporate culture and practice, improving public sector practices in employment and procurement. I can tell you that less than 1% of the global government procurement budget is spent or realized for women-owned firms, just 1%. We set a goal of at least increasing that to 2%, and it would be something like $500 billion if we were to double it. The 7th one is strengthening visibility, collective voice, and representation. Women need to be at the table. They need to have their inputs heard and valued, and they need to be part of the solution. We heard from in speaking about women with disabilities, and it applies to all women. In fact, it applies to all groups within society. They're not homogeneous. The solutions will never be one size fits all, but there's tremendous value in sharing knowledge, sharing experience, learning from each other. So I'm going to pivot now to the 4 things that I think, if we're going to strengthen this policy environment, that we really need to start focusing on. 1, clarifying for all stakeholders that women's economic is a win-win for everyone. Men, women, girls, boys, we all will benefit, and all of the undervalued groups that fall within those categorizations will also benefit. So this is for society as a whole. We know there's a whole political economy related to any of these changes. There's social issues, there are cultural issues, but if we can get everyone focused on the fact that everyone will benefit, then just perhaps we can more systematically address these issues. So systematization and institutionalization is my next point. The policy environment is dynamic. We may fix a certain law today, and we may address a particular issue, but in the changing world of work, in the changing landscape, there are other issues. It's for the same reason that today many countries have legacy laws that go back hundreds of years that impact women as economic actors today. So we need to have a systemic review of the legal and regulatory frameworks, and we need to strengthen the process by which new policies, laws, and regulations are developed and implemented to make sure that they're more transparent, they're more inclusive, and that we bring together all of the constituents. This is not, public policy making is not solely a government responsibility. It cannot be done without the constituent groups, whether it be private sector, whether it be social groups, civil society. And if we can systematize the approach to making policy, then just perhaps we won't have this circular discussion where 5 years from now we'll have the same discussion about maybe a different set of rules and regulations and constraints. So I'm really making a big push. I think we've got a lot of diagnostic tools and monitoring reports like Women, Business and Law that look at the legal and regulatory framework. Let's try to do something about it and nip it in the bud. We also need to ensure, as was done in the case of Malta, that once there is commitment to an initiative, there are funds for implementation. If not, we know, and this is in many cases, and my providing advice to governments over the years, you've seen this with a very cynical view. For political reasons, the leadership may buy into something, but then they don't fund it because they know that it won't go anywhere. So you get this dynamic, right? If we want change, then we need to fund it. But it's not in a vacuum. In justifying the funding, we need to be able to make the case of why it is important for everyone, right? Brings me back to my first point. So after Beijing, or coming out of the Beijing Compact, there is a call, if you go back and you look at it, for budgeting. The assessment is that because there's not clarity about what that means, and there's no systematic approach to gender budgeting and mainstreaming, it has not happened, or it's been very uneven and unequal. I think now is an opportunity for us to look at it. Look at the good practice examples, see what the learning is, and how we take this forward. The IMF has been showing tremendous leadership on the whole issue of gender budgeting, but so have many other institutions. Now we need to bring this down, not just on the national level, but on the subnational level. And we need to get the private sector engaged, because within their sphere, they can also take action. We need accountability, monitoring implementation, and a systematic assessment of impact, ex ante and ex post for policies, because that's where the lesson learning and the lesson drawing and the tendency to go backwards instead of forwards can be addressed. And finally, assuring, I've mentioned it before, voice, representation, and agency of women. In my view, in the current political, economic, and environmental environment, this is an all-hands-on-deck moment. It's time for action, and this is not a task for government solely, the private sector solely. If we each start by focusing on this in our sphere, wherever we sit or we stand, I think together we can make a difference.
Thank you very much indeed, Margot, for that. I'm conscious of time, and I would like to throw the floor, the sort of out for questions from the floor. We were going to do a sort of a panel discussion, but I think in the interest of time, I might just throw it out to the audience if colleagues are happy with that. So if you have a question, a microphone will find you. and hopefully we should have some sound too. Hello.
Thanks. Hello, I'm Jude Kelly. I created the WOW Women of the World festivals that are now around the world in many places. I want to ask you, as the man on the panel, and this is not a trick question at all. No, it's seriously, I think that, you know, we've often talked about being in the room together as women, constantly saying the same thing and constantly producing the evidence that change is needed. And I'm genuinely curious now as to how men like you, who totally support this, would be able to muster the armies of men necessary to make cultural change happen. Because actually pushing from beneath onto up to a culture which feels as if it can be complacent at best and hostile in certain circumstances is really a long task. And I think this is a job now that men need to get fully involved in, and the leadership of men is critical. And I wondered what you thought about that.
Thank you. I think should we take a couple of questions and then come back and answer those?
Thank you. Rina Naivera, Commissioner for Equality in Malta. The Prime Minister has mentioned the free childcare, universal free childcare in Malta. But we know that parents have different needs. So how is childcare organized? What about preschool care? What about after-school care? Are there any services which the government is offering in that respect? Also, the issue of gender pay gap was mentioned. What is the government doing? One of the reasons for the gender pay gap is lack of equal pay for work of equal value. What is the government doing in that respect? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll take one more question and then we'll go to the panel for answers. Perhaps somewhere over here. Yes, thank you. Hello.
Hi, my name is Amy Little. I'm from the Global Alzheimer's and Dementia Action Alliance. Another question again for Dr. Muscat, I'm afraid. The policies that you have, the feminist policies that you do have in Malta are really commendable, particularly the free childcare example that you gave. And as populations are ageing in the Commonwealth, we're seeing the associated health implications of that and an emergence of a so-called sandwich generation of carers that are supporting their children and often their older loved ones. So I guess some of the figures we see and some of the stats are that women carers are much more likely to give up work or reduce their hours to part-time and to lower paid jobs because of those caring responsibilities. Do you agree that governments need to prioritise action on the kind of social care crisis that most countries are seeing and to introduce employment support and policies to support those men and women, but particularly women who are most affected by that situation?
Thank you very much indeed. So we have three questions. How to muster the armies of men to try and make change. And I think that's something that others will have an opinion on as well. The different and differing needs of parents and associated childcare facilities and provision, and how to cater for and support particularly carers, particularly women, against an ageing population. But of course that will throw open different questions as well. They were directed at you, Excellency, so I might ask you to start and then we'll throw open to the panel.
First of all, I'm amazed that this is just the second edition of the Women's Forum. This was an idea that came about 2 years ago when we first organized it in Malta, and honestly I was amazed when they told me that this didn't exist, so I'm thrilled to be here. I also joked 2 years ago that the Commonwealth Summit is where heads meet. This is where brains meet. So, that also might be a half-joking reply to your question. You just tell men what to do and they do it. But I'm joking. Honestly, I think it takes a lot of commitment. I was very intrigued by Dr. Thomas's analysis of the situation. And to say the truth, I was very much in tune with what she was saying, in that it's easy to have all the studies in the world. My experience so far over these 2 terms in government is that unless there is commitment at the very top on particular issues, change doesn't happen. So even if you have the best policy in the world, even if you have, you know, the best commitment in the world, the money will not be there, and the push will not be there. So I'm lucky enough to have leadership at political level in my cabinet of people who actually believe in this. I don't need to convince. There is total commitment in this area. If you ask me when maybe I face some of the more difficult men to face on these issues, most of the time I would appeal to the fact by telling them, you know, do you have daughters? Do you have sisters? Do you have a mother? And would you want her to be treated less equally than yourself? And I do think that that sort of soft approach works. But for me, you know, it's, once again, it's a no-brainer. Even if you don't believe in equality, this is a huge untapped potential that it is there for the taking. On the question on the sandwich generation, that generation of 40-year-olds mostly that need to care for their young kids and their elderly parents, that is, I think, the real big issue for this and the next generation. That is why, while having, yes, universal free childcare, one needs to make sure that there is total access to care at home or care within institutions for those who want it. That is, if I look at these two programs, they absorb a significant amount of our budget, but it's money well spent. It's money well spent, and it is giving us a definite return on this. On what our commissioner was saying, yes, and the lady there, the special advisor was saying, it's not a monolithical or homogeneous sector. We experience this even when providing childcare. We're trying now to provide childcare to women who work at night. And when I say women, I'm just generalizing, because now we have also men who are looking for this sort of service. So yes, you're never doing enough, but at the end of the day, it makes not only social sense, but it makes economic sense. I would like to stress that.
Thank you very much. Do any of the other panel want to? Yes.
Yeah, so I can't resist but just saying to Amy that, you know, I think the issue around aging and aging cities and aging communities is a really important one. With the onset of aging, we see a lot of disabilities. And so, you know, if we start thinking about society, it's really imperative that we start designing societies so that they're inclusive for all. I mean, I think just thinking about, you know, sidewalks and all of and those type of things make sense not just for people with mobility impairments, but really makes sense for everybody. So I just had to put a plug in for that. Sorry.
If I could
Yes,
just
please.
add to that point, this is why, whether it's policy making, whether it's designing infrastructure projects, I think we need to change the approach and make the process inclusive from the beginning. And this is how we can begin to attack and ensure you can't get everything in, you can't get everything done, but if we increase the sensitivity on different levels, then I think we stand a better chance of really making some advances in specific areas.
Fabulous, thank you. I think I'm going to have to draw this to a close because of time, which is very sad, because I think we, unless you have time for maybe one more round.
A couple of other questions?
Great, okay. Well, we'll have one more round of 3 questions. Can I ask you to keep your questions short and succinct so we have time to answer them? Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much to the panel. A really interesting conversation. This question's for Dr. Margot, but certainly open to the rest of the panel. I'm Anita Williams. I work for War Child, and I'm particularly interested of women who are displaced or who are seeking refuge in other countries. Now, I understand you have experience in working with those sort of environments, and what do you think should be the policy environment to support women in those situations, particularly not just economic empowerment, but other forms of empowerment? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, here.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Nikita Lamango from Commonwealth Youth Gender Equality Network. I'm also from Malta. Two short questions.
Took over the room.
Two short questions. One, I'll continue with the immigration question my friend just did. In a context in Malta, which is at the moment seeing economic growth and also having to be open to inclusivity, tolerance, which is sometimes not as easy as the need is there. And so my question to the Prime Minister is, what is Malta doing to focus on inclusivity in the country? Because obviously in economic terms it is a need. And my second question is about political participation. And although we have very good statistics in Malta, in politics it's a bit, Parliament is only 13% and private sector is also very low. So what is the plan?
Great, thank you very much. One last question, probably not from somebody from Malta. Okay, all right. So how about over here?
It will be a quick question, and I would like to thank you, all of you, and mostly our Prime Minister also for the work he's doing on women's issues. My question comes out of my experience on these 2 days about women in technology, women in STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And I realize how important it is that policies at different levels, because the countries of the Commonwealth have different levels of education at the moment, how important it is that with this fast-growing digitalization, what policies do we need to ensure that women go for STEM subjects, because they are the future of jobs, etc., etc.
Thank you very much indeed. So a question on the policy environment for displaced people, women, a question around inclusive economic and political participation, and a question around women and girls in STEM and getting them into areas where they're currently underrepresented. Does anybody else want to open up before we turn to the Prime Minister to answer the specific? Okay, fine, okay.
First of all, I wanted to tell Shirley today I learned something. I didn't have a clue about this convention, to say the truth. So this was a learning curve for me too, and I will look into it definitely. And well done for your initiatives. I would want to, on migration, I think this is a huge subject, and really and truly, if we start off on that tangent, it's until time immemorial. But definitely, I think the approach that we should always adopt is one of open borders. That doesn't mean a free-for-all. It means but a realization that in order to become more prosperous, prosperity must go around within a wider number of people. Containing prosperity to a small number of people actually whittles down that prosperity. Widening up to a wider circle increases that prosperity. And I think that's our approach to migration. It doesn't go to mean a free-for-all approach. It means a manageable approach, but one that acknowledges that the more we are, the better we are. Second and final point I will make, on maybe preconcepts that we have. So as a society, our small country, we always, I think, thought of ourselves of being non-discriminatory in our approach, not putting obstacles to women in getting in, say, the labor market, until we started looking at the detail. And I don't know whether my country classifies as one of those 90% of countries where there is an impediment. But yes, I would be very interested in that report. But I can list you one impediment we had until very recently, and where it wasn't that easy to make the change. So we have maternity leave, but until very recently, maternity leave was paid for by those employers employing women. That in itself creates a barrier, because given a choice, an employer might argue, if I employ a woman, there might be a hidden cost that if she becomes pregnant, I would need to pay for her maternity leave. So we changed the law. We distributed that cost over all employees, and now it makes no difference whether you employ a man or women, you pay a very, very small percentage, a point, I don't know how much, percent of the wage that goes into a national kitty, a national fund, and that in itself funds maternity leave. And that has done away with an obstacle which was, to be very clear, quite invisible to most of us, but which was creating a deficit in the way in which we treat men and women.
Thank you.
I just want to pick up on, thank you for taking that lead on the immigration question, because it's a broader issue, of course. But when it comes, your question dealt with women who are disproportionately affected. Yes. You can say the same thing in any situation that has human well-being implications, and that invariably comes with a very critical urgency, particularly in refugee situations, right? And I think that if we're guided by the principles of being inclusive in our policy design and responsiveness, being transparent, accountable, but also ensuring that it's done and delivered in a timely way, then at least we can deal with the critical issues and then work out over the longer term some of the more systemic issues. And in the refugee situation, as in resiliency in climate change, those critical issues require very urgent and specific responses. But if we design those in an inclusive way, then I think we stand a better chance of ensuring that we protect those who are disproportionately disadvantaged, whether they be women or children, the elderly. Those are the ones that are invariably most exposed. And of course, managing the politics of it, which it can be, and we're seeing it today, is very explosive.
Thank you very much indeed. I think I'm just going to close and try and summarize what has been a really wide-ranging and fantastically stimulating conversation. I think we've heard that it's not homogeneous, the challenges are not homogeneous, so the solutions need to be varied as well, that leadership is essential from the top, but that can be buoyed by grassroots action that really sort of galvanizes and changes will and opinion. So governments need to be working with civil society, with NGOs, grassroots level, so we have an inclusive implementation of what we've been talking about. And we've heard a lot about how we make the shift from words to action. We've heard all hands on deck. We've heard the time is now, that it's a no-brainer. So we need to work out what it is that can really make that tipping point. So I'm going to ask for the panel, if you'll bear with me just one more minute. What is it, in one sentence, for you that could really make a difference to shift from words to action, that the Commonwealth can take away from this session today?
If I may kick it off, individual responsibility, the power of one. Each one of us can contribute. If we want to make policy change, we want to bring men along, talk to the man next to you, but identify those who have the political capital, not the will, to make the change.
Very good.
More women leaders.
Thank you. And as a women leader?
For me, it's bridging the gap, the gender gap in our economies. Yeah.
For me, as Margaret says that leaving here today, you know, we are to make a commitment. And I'm asking you all to make a commitment to go back to your country and lobby your government to ratify the Convention 189, so we can have economic empowerment and legal status for domestic workers. We can, I know it's a 1 minute, but I have to say this. We need the legal barriers to be taken away from domestic worker. Because domestic work is work, just like other workers, and they need to be protected under the law. Thank you very much.
So I would say when we use a gender lens to policy or budgeting, to make sure that when we do that, we include women with disabilities. It's pretty straightforward. Include them.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Thank you for hanging on a little later as well. And a huge thanks to every member of the panel today. It's been fantastic. And you heard it here first.